here we go. It's 11 o'clock, can't sleep, so figured I'd just come back downstairs and make you guys another video notes. We're picking up where we left off with the next lobe. We've been moving from the most anterior portion of the brain to the posterior portion, and then we're going to wrap around to the lateral sides, but we've gone frontal lobe, then we've gone to the parietal lobe. Now we're working on the most posterior lobe of the brain called the occipital lobe. So without further hesitation, here we go. The occipital lobe is located deep the occipital bone. Have you noticed a pattern yet with all these lobes and how the fact that they're actually located deep the actual skull bone from which they lie? So if you remember the skull bones when we went over those, you should have no problem remembering the location of all the lobes. But it is the most ventral lobe, or posterior lobe, which starts anteriorly at the parieto-occipital sulcus. If you remember correctly, the parieto-occipital sulcus is the one that divides the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. So now we're working from that sulcus towards the back of the brain. And it's also bordered by the cerebellum and a small amount of the temporal lobe. The primary function of the occipital lobe, and really probably the only thing we're really going to talk about, is the processing, integration, interpretation of vision and the visual stimuli. Not the absorption of visual stimuli, because that is done by the eyes itself. Then a signal is generated by the eyes, which travels down travels down the nerves that connect to the eyes to the brain, but before it does that, it travels from the eyeballs, runs into the brain, crisscrosses at the optic chiasm, which is on the most inferior surface of the brain, and then it works towards the occipital lobes, where it meets the visual cortex. So if we're looking at here, everything that is covered in red is in fact the occipital lobe. Just to point out a couple things to you here, we do want to know that here is where the parieto-occipital sulcus would be located, dividing the brain from the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. You will notice that it does come in contact a little bit with the temporal lobe, and then here you have the transverse fissure that actually separates the cerebellum, which is down here, from the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe might actually be one of these smaller lobes. Keep in mind, the occipital lobe makes up, there are actually two occipital lobes. There's a left occipital lobe and a right occipital lobe. So we're going to get right into the cortical regions. Rewind again. The cerebral cortex is that rind, or that gray matter that wraps around the outside of the brain. It's kind of like an orange peel. It's where the gray matter's the densest, and it's also where you have a large concentration of somatic cell bodies, which in turn becomes the most important regions of the brain. The first one we're going to talk about is called the primary visual cortex. This is the main area that's responsible for sight itself. It's where the action potentials that are generated and travel down the optic nerves carry the signal for size, color, light, motion, dimensions of whatever the eyes are picking up. So it's the actual place where all of that information is routed directly to. Your primary visual cortex is very interesting because it's actually divided into your left and right visual fields. It's not necessarily divided based upon the right and left eye as much as it's based on the visual field. So we kind of need to talk about what visual field actually means. Take a look at this picture right here. You'll notice you have the left eyeball, and you'll notice how you have the right eyeball here. If you'll notice that you have what is called the left visual field will be everything that is in red right here and right here. So if you had a dividing line or a barrier between your eyeballs to where it kind of looked like this, and you could close one eye and then close the other eye just like this, you will have one individual eye is divided into the left visual field and the right visual field. So, and you'll learn this when we go over the eyeball in the next unit, but when images come in through the eye, they are actually backwards and upside down. So anything that comes in from the left side hits the right side of the retina on each eyeball and then travels down the optic nerve. And here's what's extremely interesting here. If you notice how the left visual field is colored red for each side, it travels in and reaches the optic chiasm. So just so you know, the optic chiasm is this thing right here. When it reaches the optic chiasm, you will notice that anything that is associated with the left visual field or colored red is actually routed to the right side of the body until it reaches the visual cortex, which is sorry, which is down here. And then you'll notice everything in blue is associated with the right field of vision. So everything that is in the right field of vision is actually routed in, hits the optic chiasm, and travels to the left visual cortex. So it's not necessarily because the information that is coming in is associated with each individual eyeball as much as it is associated with which visual field it's supposed to go to. So let's rewind here real quick. That means that if you have the dividing line and you close your eye, that means anything that I'm seeing over here is coming into my eyeball, going into my brain, routed through the optic chiasm, and being switched over to the right occipital lobe. Alright, so the next little region we're going to talk about, aside from the visual cortex, is the visual association area. So all the signals come in and get routed to the visual cortex, and you have signals carrying things like colors, size of the objects, all those things. Well, then your visual association area is what actually interprets that information that is acquired through that primary visual cortex. So things that it does is it helps store long-term memories of visual information such as facial recognition. So there is a very small portion of that visual association area that is solely designated to facial recognition. So what that means is if you obtained or someone obtained the right type of brain damage in that right area or the correct area of the visual association area, they could actually lose the ability to associate faces with names. Can you imagine that being the only region of your brain that was actually hurt? And so you go your entire life meeting people. Hi, my name is Matt Riffey. Hi, my name is Matt Riffey. Hi, my name is Matt Riffey. And you cannot associate a face with a name of anybody you meet. That would be absolutely brutal. What it also does is it allows you to have the ability to see images based on the eyes, but it allows you to interpret what's being sent through the nerves. So different types of interpretation are done in different parts of the visual association area. And I actually have a video showing a different type of visual impairment. It doesn't have to do with the eyes, but what it actually has to do with is when it's routed to the brain, a mishap goes on and you actually end up with certain impairments. One of the big things that you can end up with is something called visual agnosia. It's the inability to assemble visual information and interpret visual information, and it's usually due to damage along some kind of neural pathway to the visual cortex and visual association area. So somewhere along the lines where the images are obtained by the eyeballs and that action potential is sent through the optic nerves, and then it goes to the optic chiasm and it's routed to the visual cortex and then interpreted by the visual association area, somewhere along those lines when all those neural pathways and connections and synapses occur, there's been some kind of damage or some kind of mishap which actually causes somebody to lose the ability to do certain items associated with vision. So they can see things, but it's almost like their brain can't actually make sense of what they're seeing. And that's called visual agnosia. So if you remember correctly when we talked about the parietal lobe, this is very important. He doesn't have parietal lobe damage because he actually can associate things by touch.
Evans
So
suffered
even
brain
though he
injury
can't
after being
physically
hit by
see
a
the
car
object as
a few
whole,
years
he can
back,
see that it's silver,
and that caused him
he
to
can
lose the
grab it and he can
capacity to
associate it
recognize
by
everyday
touch and
objects.
actually trigger memory to know what it is.
We asked Kevin what he sees when he looks at things.
I see colours, shapes, punctuated by faces, the faces of people which I really recognise, and they stand out much more than anything else. That's why I can't read words or read music anymore. So I still can imagine what it looks like in my mind's eye, but I can't imagine what it looks like, or I can't see what it looks like when I look at it. So essentially, I find things through colour.
In fact, the brain needs both the structural and semantic processing to be able to interpret information transmitted through vision.
I can sometimes pick out small components of an object and by using memory as a reference infer what it might be. Like if something's long and silver, it could be a spoon or a fork or a knife, and usually I'll use my hands to touch the end of it so I know, oh, it's a fork or it's a knife or it's a spoon. So memory does play an important role in that and in everything I look. I mean, I come to this chair. I know it's a chair. I don't know what type of chair it is. I know it's pink.
So this is
but
very
I was
important
able to
here.
sit down in
He's
it. But this is
looking
my
at
house, so I know where everything
and he
is.
has the ability to
Before
tell
I could read
who is
music,
in the picture.
but now I can't read music anymore. So I deconstruct music in my mind's ear. So I listen to the piece and I try to separate the different instruments, what they're playing, so the bass part, the treble part, the melody, and then or any harmonies, and then I reconstruct it back for the guitar. So I don't actually, I'm not listening to something, the singularity is broken down. I think we do that when we learn about anything. When you're a child and you take something apart, you deconstruct it to find out how it works and you put it back together again. And then you have this intimate knowledge about how the object works and what it is. And I do that with in my mind with things that I come across, especially with music anyway, I deconstruct it. That's my son, my oldest son with Santa Claus. Yeah, Santa Claus, my oldest son. And this is one that's with my youngest son. When he was younger, he's a teenager now. And, yeah, behind that angelic face is a demon child. That's my eldest son when he was, must have been about 6 weeks old, 2 months old.
So that's visual agnosia. Now there are several different versions of this type, but as you notice here, he has some abilities and he doesn't have other abilities, all solely based upon where the damage occurred.
That's Hayden, my youngest son. When he was,
So if we're looking at the occipital lobe, which you have to
And do you see
understand
the
is the primary
details of
visual
the face?
cortex
Like, do you
is
see
going
the
to be
eyes
located on
clearly?
the
What
absolute
is it?
backside
What
of
is
the
it in
occipital
the
lobe of
image
the
that
most,
you recognize?
dorsal
the whole
side of
face,
the
and I'll
lobe.
tell you why you can see. I can see a whole face,
The
but I
visual
can't see a whole object.
association area
Like this thing
is
here,
going to
I only
be
see parts of
more
it.
anterior
Like
of
I
that.
see these
So this
diagonal
is the
things
area
here,
where signals are routed.
but I
and
can't
come
see the
in.
whole thing.
Here's where they are processed.
But with the
What that
face,
then
I see the
means
whole
is
thing.
there's
So
some
you say, well,
little
how come
section in this
I can't
occipital
see
lobe
that in its
that is
entirety,
solely dedicated
but
to
yet I
facial
can see the face
recognition.
in its
There's one for
entirety?
object
Because a
recognition. There's one
completely
for color
different center of the
recognition.
brain
So you might be able to
processes
see faces.
faces
You might be able
and
to
processes objects.
recognize them.
And
You
in
might be
me,
able to
the
tell me
part
that
that
it's a triangle,
processes
but you might not
objects,
be able to tell me
symbols
that
has
it's a
been
purple
damaged.
triangle or a red
But the
triangle or
part
something along
that
those lines.
processes faces is
And
fine.
that's where we're going to
And that's
stop.
how I'm
So
able to
that
recognize
was the
people's faces.
occipital lobe.
And I
Again, let me
recognize
know if you have any
my
questions.
colleagues at work,
If you need
my
anything,
family.
I would love to help you out.
You know, I'd much rather have the condition I have. I'm lucky
Thank you for everything you do.
because I'd rather have that than not be able to recognize faces. That would be awful.